is the 3rd of August on the Khandha-samyutta, chapter 22 of the Samyutta Nikaya. Now we come to Sutta 22.3. On one occasion, the Venerable Mahathera was dwelling among the people of Avanti on Mount Papata at Kuraragara. Then the householder Halittakani approached the Venerable Mahathera, paid homage to him, sat down to one side and said to him, "Noble Sir, this was said by the Blessed One in the questions of Magandhya in the Attaka Vaga." Stop here for a moment. This Attaka Vaga is found in the Sutta Nipata. And Sutta Nipata is one of the books in the Khandha Nikaya. But the Sutta Nipata is supposed to be one of the very old, earliest books, supposed to be very reliable. So in that book, the Buddha said, "Having left home to roam without abode, in the village the sage is intimate with none, rid of sensual pleasures, without expectations. He will not engage people in dispute." How, Venerable Sir, should the meaning of this stated by the Blessed One in brief be understood in detail? Stop here for a moment. This Venerable Mahathera is supposed to be very good in explaining the suttas. And this verses by the Buddha, having left home to roam without an abode, without a dwelling, in the village the sage is intimate with none, rid of sensual pleasures, without expectations, would not engage people in dispute. Then the Venerable Mahathera explained, the form element householder is the home of consciousness. One whose consciousness is shackled by lust for the form element is called one who roams about in a home. The feeling element is the home of consciousness. The perception element, the volition element is the home of consciousness. One whose consciousness is shackled by lust for these aggregates is called one who roams about in a home. It is in such a way that one roams about in a home. And how, householder, does one roam about homeless? The desire, lust, delight and craving, the engagement and clinging, the mental standpoints, adherences and underlying tendencies regarding the form element, these have been abandoned by the Tathagata, the Buddha, cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated so that they are no more subject to future arising. Therefore the Tathagata is called one who roams about homeless. The desire, lust, delight and craving, the engagement and clinging, the mental standpoints, adherences and underlying tendencies regarding the feeling element, perception element, volition element, consciousness element, these have been abandoned by the Tathagata, cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated so that they are no more subject to future arising. Therefore the Tathagata is called one who roams about homeless. This in such a way that one roams about homeless. Let's stop here for a moment. So in the verses, the Buddha said, having left home to roam without abode, without a dwelling. Here, Venerable Mahathera is explaining that roam without an abode, without a dwelling. If you are in a dwelling, you are imprisoned in that dwelling. So here, if a person roams about in a home, remember Mahathera says that he is imprisoned by lust for form, feeling, perception, volition and even consciousness. And one who roams about homeless has cut off the desire and lust for form or body, feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. So his explanation is that home and homeless is not the physical home, but the mentally being imprisoned. Now to continue. And how, householder, does one roam about in an abode? Or just now I was talking about home. By diffusion and confinement in the abode consisting in the sign of forms, one is called one who roams about in an abode. by diffusion and confinement in the abode consisting in the sign of sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, mental phenomena. One is called one who roams about in an abode. And how, householder, does one roam about without abode? Diffusion and confinement in the abode consisting in the sign of forms. These have been abandoned by the Tathagata, cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated so that they are no more subject to future arising. Therefore, the Tathagata is called one who roams about without abode. Diffusion and confinement in the abode consisting in the sign of sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, mental phenomena. These have been abandoned by the Tathagata, cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated so that they are no more subject to future arising. Therefore, the Tathagata is called one who roams about without abode. It is in such a way that one roams about without abode. So here he's explaining that if the mind is diffused and confined in the abode, it's a dwelling in the sign of forms, the sign of sounds, odors, etc., the six senses. So if our attention is always going out through these six senses, then our mind becomes diffused and confined. So roaming without an abode is not being diffused and confined in the mind because of these six senses. And how, householder, is one intimate in the village? Here, householder, someone lives in association with lay people. He rejoices with them and sorrows with them. He is happy when they are happy and sad when they are sad. And he involves himself in their affairs and duties. It is in such a way that one is intimate in the village. And how, householder, is one intimate with none in the village? Here, householder, a monk does not live in association with lay people. He does not rejoice with them or sorrow with them. He is not happy when they are happy and sad when they are sad. And he does not involve himself in their affairs and duties. It is in such a way that one is intimate with none in the village. We'll stop here for a moment. Here, a monk is said to be intimate in the village if he associates too much with lay people. And how, householder, is one not rid of sensual pleasures? Here, householder, someone is not devoid of lust, desire, affection, thirst, passion and craving in regard to sensual pleasures. It is in such a way that one is not rid of sensual pleasures. And how, householder, is one rid of sensual pleasures? Here, householder, someone is devoid of lust, desire, affection, thirst, passion and craving in regard to sensual pleasures. It is in such a way that one is rid of sensual pleasures. This one we can understand. And how, householder, does one entertain expectations? Here, householder, someone thinks, may I have such form or body in the future, may I have such feeling in the future, may I have such perception in the future, volition, consciousness in the future. It is in such a way that one entertains expectations. And how, householder, is one without expectations? Here, householder, someone does not think, may I have such a body in the future, such a feeling, perception, volition and consciousness in the future. It is in such a way that one is without expectations. And how, householder, does one engage people in dispute? Here, householder, someone engages in such talk as this. You don't understand this Dhamma Vinaya. I understand Dhamma Vinaya. What? You understand this Dhamma Vinaya? You are practicing wrongly and practicing rightly. What should have been said before, you said after. What should have been said after, you said before. I am consistent, you are inconsistent. What you took so long to think out has been overturned. Your thesis has been refuted. Go off to rescue your thesis, or you are defeated. Or disentangle yourself if you can. It is in such a way that one engages people in dispute. And how, householder, does one not engage people in dispute? Here, householder, someone does not engage in such talk as this. You don't understand this Dhamma Vinaya, etc. It is in such a way that one does not engage people in dispute. Thus, householder, when it was said by the Blessed One in the questions of Magandhya in the Atthakavagga, having left home to roam without abode, in the village the sage is intimate with none, rid of sensual pleasures, without expectations. He would not engage people in dispute. It is in such a way that the meaning of this, stated in brief by the Blessed One, should be understood in detail. So you see, 4 lines of Venerable Mahathera can explain in such long length and detail. 22.5 at Savatthi, there the Blessed One said, monks, develop concentration. A monk who is concentrated understands things as they really are. And what does he understand as it really is? The origin and passing away of form, the origin and passing away of feeling, the origin and passing away of perception, volition, consciousness. Stop here for a moment. So here, Buddha says that we should develop concentration so that we can understand things as they really are. And what is it important for us to understand? Here the Buddha says the 5 aggregates, how the 5 aggregates originate and pass away. And what monks is the origin of body, of form? What is the origin of feeling, perception, volition and consciousness? Here monks, one seeks delight, one welcomes, one remains holding. And what is it that one seeks delight in? What does one welcome? To what does one remain holding? One seeks delight in form or body, welcomes it and remains holding to it. As a consequence of this, delight arises. Delight in form is clinging. With one's clinging as condition, being comes to be. With existence with being as condition, birth. With birth as condition, aging and death. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure and despair come to be. Such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. Similarly, one seeks delight in feeling, perception, volition and consciousness, welcomes it and remains holding to it. As a consequence, delight arises, etc. Such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. This monks is the origin of form, the origin of feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. Stop here for a moment. So here, the Buddha says the origin of body, feeling, perception and volition, consciousness, that means the origin of body and mind, is that one is attached to the 5 aggregates. When one is attached to the 5 aggregates, being arises. If you remember the other day we read the 12 links of dependent origination. Upadana is attachment or clinging. Upadana is the condition for bhava to arise. And bhava is this being, this perception that I am or I exist. So with being as condition, then jati, birth or rebirth takes place. With jati as condition, then you have jara, marana, aging and death, and all the different types of suffering is the origin of suffering. So similarly, one is attached to feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. So being attached to it, then this attachment, upadana, gives rise to bhava. Similarly, all that. So that is how the 5 aggregates arise. The 5 aggregates arise from attachment, and attachment brings about being and then rebirth. And what monks is the passing away of body? What is the passing away of feeling, perception, volition and consciousness? Here monks, one does not seek delight, one does not welcome, one does not remain holding. And what is it that one does not seek delight in? What doesn't one welcome? To what doesn't one remain holding? One does not seek delight in body, does not welcome it, does not remain holding to it. As a consequence of this, delight in body ceases. With the cessation of delight comes cessation of clinging. With the cessation of clinging, cessation of being, etc. Such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. Similarly, one does not seek delight in feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. One does not welcome it, does not remain holding to it. As a consequence of this, delight in the aggregate ceases, such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. This monks is the passing away of body, it is the passing away of feeling, perception, volition, consciousnness. So this last part, the Buddha says, how does the body, feeling, perception, volition and consciousness cease? They cease when we do not delight in the 5 aggregates. Delight can be represented by craving. So if you have no craving, then the next link in the chain of dependent origination, upadana, the clinging also stops. When clinging stops, then bhava, being stops. And being stops, then jati, rebirth stops. When jati, rebirth stops, then aging and dying and the whole mass of suffering ceases. This is how body and mind, the five aggregates, cease. So remember the first part, the Buddha says, if you want to understand the five aggregates, you have to develop concentration. Because when you develop concentration, samadhi, especially the Buddha says, the perfect samadhi is the four jhanas. If you have the four jhanas, then the mind becomes so clear and the mind becomes bright. Then only you can see things as they really are. Then you can understand the five aggregates. You understand the five aggregates, then suffering will cease. 22.6 at Savatthi, the Buddha said, monks, make an exertion in seclusion. A monk who is secluded understands things as they really are. And what does he understand as it really is? The origin and passing away of body, feeling, perception, volition, consciousness. And what monks is the origin of body, etc. The rest of the sutta is exactly the same as the previous one. The only difference here is that instead of the Buddha asking us to develop concentration, here the Buddha is asking us practice seclusion. And seclusion, as I mentioned before, there are two types of seclusion: body seclusion, kaya viveka, and mental seclusion, chitta viveka. Kaya viveka is being physically secluded from others. Either you live alone, or if you live with others in a monastery, and then you are aloof from them. You don't associate, don't talk too much with people. And then chitta viveka is mental seclusion. Your mind is secluded from the world of the six senses. You go into deep meditation, and that is a higher form of seclusion. So here the Buddha is also stressing seclusion. So two things are important, concentration and seclusion. 22.7 at Savatthi, monks, I will teach you agitation through clinging and non-agitation through non-clinging. Listen to that and attend closely, I will speak. Yes, my good sir, those monks replied. The Blessed One said, and how, monks, is there agitation through clinging? Here, monks, the unlearned ordinary person who does not see Aryas, noble ones, is unskilled and untrained in the Dhamma, who does not see superior persons and is unskilled and untrained in the Dhamma, regards body as self, or self as possessing body, or body as in the self, or self as in the body. That body of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of body, his consciousness becomes preoccupied with the change of body. Agitation and a constellation of mental states, born of preoccupation with the change of body, remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he is frightened, distressed and anxious, and through clinging he becomes agitated. Similarly, with feeling, perception, volition and consciousness, all these change, and then he becomes agitated, and all the different mental states arise out of his preoccupation with the change. So he becomes frightened, distressed, etc. It is in such a way, monks, that there is agitation through clinging. Stop here for a moment. So here the Buddha is saying that the ordinary, unlearned person, he attaches to body, feeling, perception, volition as self, or as belonging to self, or self is in the aggregates, or the aggregates are in the self. But then when the aggregates change, because it is their nature to change, then he becomes mentally occupied with this change. That means he becomes agitated and he thinks about it. When he thinks about it, the mind proliferates, all his worries multiply. Then he becomes more agitated, so he becomes frightened, distressed and all that. This is how there is agitation because of clinging. And how, monks, is there non-agitation to non-clinging? Here, monks, the learned noble disciple who sees noble ones and is skilled and trained in the Dhamma, who sees superior persons and is skilled and trained in the Dhamma, does not regard body as self, or self as possessing body, or body as in the self, or self as in that body, then that body of his changes and alters. Despite the change and alteration of body, his consciousness does not become preoccupied with the change of form. I mean, it's not worried, it's not agitated. No agitation and constellation of mental states born of preoccupation with the change of body remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is not obsessed, he is not frightened, distressed or anxious, and through non-clinging he does not become agitated. Similarly, for feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. This in such a way, monks, that there is non-agitation through non-clinging. So in the second case, the person, the Aryan disciple who is learned in the Aryan Dhamma, who is trained in the Aryan Dhamma, he does not regard the five aggregates as the self or as belonging to self, or the aggregates being in the self, or the self as being in the aggregates. So when the five aggregates change, because it is their nature to change, then he does not worry about it. Because he is not worried about it, he does not become agitated and obsessed with all these thoughts. Then he is not frightened, not distressed. That is how there is no agitation because of non-clinging. So it is the clinging that gives us suffering. If there is no clinging, there is no suffering. Now we come to 22.18. That's on page 870. As Savatthi, Buddha said, monks, body is impermanent, body or form. The cause and condition for the arising of form or body is also impermanent. As body has originated from what is impermanent, how could it be permanent? Feeling is impermanent. Similarly, perception, volition, consciousness is impermanent. The cause and condition for the arising of the aggregates is also impermanent. As the aggregates have originated from what is impermanent, how could it be permanent? Seeing thus, he understands. Seeing thus, the learned noble disciple experiences revulsion towards form or body, revulsion towards feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. Experiencing revulsion, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, his mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge it's liberated. He understands, destroyed is birth, the holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more for this state of being. So here the Buddha is saying that the aggregates are impermanent, and the cause and condition for the arising of the aggregates is also impermanent. So because the aggregates have arisen from what is impermanent, how can we take it to be permanent? What does this mean? This means, for example, one day suppose you walk along the path and then you see a beautiful flower. When you see a beautiful flower, because it's beautiful, you think you want to preserve it. But then this flower came about because of certain conditions, because of the plant was there, because of rainfall, because of sunlight, because of fertilizer and all that, the air and all that. Then the flower emerged one day. But because the flower is dependent on so many conditions, and those conditions that the flower is dependent on are also impermanent. So how can the flower itself be permanent? So for example, the flower depends on the plant itself. And the plant being a small plant, one day is going to die. So when the plant dies, how can the flower not die? So in the same way, for example, a shadow one day, when the sun rises in the morning, you see the shadow of a tree. That shadow was cast because of the sun being at an angle, was cast because of the tree being solid, and then you see that shadow. But the condition for that shadow, namely the sun and the tree, are impermanent. So very soon the sun is going to shift. When the sun shifts, then that shadow is not going to be there. So since the shadow is impermanent, and the condition for it to arise is also impermanent, so the shadow is even more impermanent than the condition for it to arise. Right? So in the same way, our body and our mind is dependent on so many conditions, and all these conditions are impermanent. So because all these conditions that support our body and mind is impermanent, then our body and mind is even more impermanent since it's dependent on so many conditions. So that's how we should not want it to be permanent, because it can never be permanent. So without being permanent, we should not attach to it, because very soon it will disappear. 22.22 at Savatthi. There the Blessed One said, "Monks, I will teach you the burden, the carrier of the burden, the taking up of the burden, and the laying down of the burden. Listen to that. And what, monks, is the burden? It should be said, the 5 aggregates of clinging, of attachment." What 5? The 4 of body aggregate. Body aggregate, yes, is subject to clinging or of attachment. The feeling aggregate of attachment. The perception, volition and consciousness aggregates of attachment. This is called the burden. Stop here for a moment. These aggregates are called Pancha-Khandha. Pancha-Khandha, 5 aggregates. And normally we refer to them as Pancha-Upadana Khandha. Pancha-Upadana Khandha. The 5 aggregates of attachment. 5 aggregates of attachment. 5 aggregates of attachment. These 3 words are 5 aggregates attachment. The most important is the word attachment. It is because of attachment that suffering arises. If there is no attachment to the aggregates, then there is no suffering. If we behave like the tree is not attached to its body, the tree is not attached to its leaf, its fruit and all that, so the tree does not suffer. But we are attached to our head, to our nose, to our fingers, all the parts of us which are impermanent. So the suffering comes about because of attachment. So these 5 aggregates are a burden. When you have the 5 aggregates, we are carrying a burden. We are carrying the burden of this body and the mind. So the burden is the 5 aggregates, the body and the mind. And what, monks, is the carrier of the burden? It should be said, the person. This venerable one of such a name and clan. This is called the carrier of the burden. Stop here for the moment. The carrier of the burden is the person. Who is this person? This person is the fellow who thinks, I exist, I am this body, I am this mind. Once you have that I, then you think that you are a being in the world. So you think that you exist in the world. So when you think you exist, you have the notion that you exist because of the body and the mind. You take the body and the mind to be you. So the moment you think I exist, you carry the burden of this body and mind. And what, monks, is the taking up of the burden? It is this craving that leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for non-existence. This is called the taking up of the burden. So, stop here for a moment. So, we take up the burden when we have craving. This craving is seeking delight here, seeking delight there. You see, most people in the world, they live their lives like that. Always trying to find enjoyment and happiness. Watching TV, playing with the computer, going touring overseas, trying to buy a big Porsche or Maserati sports car and all this. So always trying to find happiness here, happiness there. But unfortunately, that happiness cannot be satisfied. If you get all the things in the world, you're not contented. You still don't have happiness. That happiness is only momentary. It's not the deep happiness that most people want. So the taking up the burden is due to the craving. And what, monks, is the laying down of the burden? It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving. The giving up, the relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. This is called the laying down of the burden. This is what the Blessed One said. Having said this, the fortunate one, the teacher, further said, 5 aggregates are truly burdens. The burden carrier is the person. Taking up the burden is suffering in the world. Laying the burden down is blissful. Having laid the heavy burden down without taking up another burden, Having drawn out craving with its root, one is free from hunger, fully quenched. This last part, the few verses, sometimes we chant at night. The one bara, have, pancha, khanda, and all that. So, because of craving, we take this body and the mind to be the self, so that we can enjoy life. We think this body and this mind gives us enjoyment. That's only when we decide, after a lot of suffering, we decide to put down this burden, put down this craving, then only we lay down the burden.